All Other Must Be Boiled, A Feast with Dragons, and A Ball of Beasts are all fan-created reading orders designed to combine the events of A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons within a singular chronology. But today, comrades, I'm going to tell you why seeking out all these reading orders is actually not necessary, and why you should just focus on reading each book separately. At least on your first read-through anyway. Advocate here, like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. So a little bit of background. After the release of A Storm of Swords, the third novel in George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series on August 8th, 2000, George immediately began work on the next installment in the series, a book he planned to call A Dance with Dragons. That book was originally meant to take place 5 years after the events of A Storm of Swords, but after struggling to make the time skip work, a topic for another time, George abandoned the idea and instead focused on writing a new, unplanned book that would take place before the events he had intended for A Dance with Dragons, a book he would call A Feast for Crows. So George went on his merry way, typing all he could for this A Feast for Crows book, which, per a 2003 partial manuscript, included the still-alive POVs of Jon Snow, Daenerys Targaryen, and Tyrion Lannister. And in addition to that, newly promoted POV characters like Cersei Lannister, Brienne of Tarth, and Asha Greyjoy. However, as a self-described, quote-unquote, gardener of his stories, meaning that George prefers to write as he goes along as opposed to having an outline structure, Feast soon began to sprawl a little bit out of control. So much so that as he was writing a lot about the various isolated regions around Westeros and how the War of the Five Kings had affected them, he came into the year 2005 with somewhere north of 1,500 completed manuscript pages for this book. Yet despite that, he seemed to be nowhere near to finishing that book. So to fix this ever-growing garden of a headache, George decided that he ultimately would split A Feast for Crows into two. However, there was a problem. You see, although a book split sounds fine in theory, George R. R. Martin doesn't actually write his series chronologically, but rather by point of view character. Meaning that although he could have some arcs near completion for a few characters, there would be others that would be barely underway. If he divided the story that he already had completed in half as is, he would not have a balanced mix of chapters across all characters. So to solve this, George ultimately decided to split the book geographically by character rather than chronologically, meaning that the characters whose arcs he had written to near completion, predominantly those characters in southern Westeros, would have their stories told in A Feast for Crows. All the while, the characters whose stories still needed more work, predominantly those in northern Westeros and in Essos, would be held off to A Dance with Dragons. All this ultimately leading to the publication of two separate books containing two separate casts of characters encompassing two separate sets of events, all set chronologically congruent with each other. Well, for the most part, but we'll cover that shortly. This overlapping timeline has led many readers in the fandom to claim that A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons are really just one massive book split apart by geography. Now, while it's true that George did initially intend to write just one single book prior to this book split, I don't agree that Feast and Dance are just one big book. Yes, the timelines run parallel, but Feast and Dance are still two distinct novels, each packed with their own arcs, themes, and scope. Now, whether the events held within each book feel satisfying to you as a reader is completely subjective, but these are in fact two separate works. And one of the reasons I say this is because several of the events held within the final version of A Dance with Dragons weren't actually part of George's initial vision for that book, back when he intended for this to be just the fourth installment in the series. After splitting Feast into two, George suddenly found himself with far more breathing room in Dance that allowed him to expand on certain plot lines that hadn't existed before. For example, Daenerys' flight from Daznak's pit, her dramatic escape on Drogon, was originally slated to appear as her second chapter in one of the early Feast manuscripts. However, after George abandoned the 5-year gap and divided the narrative, that moment was pushed further back into Daenerys 9 of A Dance with Dragons. The filling in of new Daenerys material, in addition to the expansion of several other character arcs, wouldn't have happened without this split. In other words, George set out to write 2 complete books worth of story after he discovered he now had the page space for it. Which is part of my qualm with the It's just one big book, reasoning that some readers use to seek out some of the Feast and Dance combined reading orders. Because it's not just one big book. These are two big books. Now, for the record, I don't have an issue with any of these fan-created reading orders. They all have their own merits, and if someone wants to reread the series that way just for fun, then that's totally fine. I'm all for having fun with a reread. But when a first-time reader is told that they have to read Feast and Dance this way, as it's the quote-unquote true way to experience a story, then that's where I take issue. That said, I completely understand a new reader's potential frustration with how these books are currently structured. A character split is super frustrating when you're going through A Feast for Crows for the first time and you learn secondhand about all these things happening at the Wall or in Essos or at White Harbor, and you're not able to see those events play out in the book you're currently reading. It's annoying. It can feel like these stories leaving you out, closing the door on you until you reach A Dance with Dragons. But having read both these books separately and together through the All Leather Must Be Boiled reading order, I can tell you guys from experience that the best way to experience this story is the way George intended, one book at a time. These novels were written to stand on their own, and the story just hits that much harder when you let each one breathe in its own space. Another reason why I think readers should stray away from a combined reading order on a first read-through is the pacing. Now, pacing is subjective. A Cersei Lannister chapter exploring the politics of Westeros might have me completely hooked, while my friend the Grease Goblins might be completely bored out of his mind and just want to power through to get to the next chapter. By the by, this is purely hypothetical, so totally no shade intended, Grease. Regardless, both A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons are widely considered amongst the fandom to be the slowest entries in the series. And while slow doesn't necessarily mean bad, the slower pacing can become rather noticeable when you merge these two books into one. To help illustrate what I mean, let's take a look at the timeline of events within each book. The story of A Feast for Crows spans roughly about 5 months. The story of A Dance with Dragons also covers those same 5 months, but also goes 3 months beyond that, for a total of 8 months between these two books. Additionally, if we look at word counts for each of these books, by the by, huge shout out to Admiral Kurd for these values, A Feast for Crows sits at 300,533 words, and A Dance with Dragons sits at 422,156 words. When combined, these two books encompass 722,689 words, covering just 8 months of story time, meaning that during a combined read-through, it takes George an average of about 90,336 words just to move through a single month of story. That's significantly slower than Feast on its own at about 60,106 words per month, or Dance at 52,768 words per month. That's also slower than the pace of the first 3 books in the series as well. Now, to be clear, the length of time a story covers doesn't determine how good it is. You can have an intense, unforgettable sequence happen all in one night, i.e. the Red Wedding, or you can have weeks, maybe even months pass by quickly without much going on, i.e. Daenerys and the Red Waste in A Clash of Kings. My point here isn't about quality, but about how much slower Feast and Dance feel when read together. And within this singular chronology, Feast and Dance definitely, mathematically, read slower. A third reason I don't think these combined reading orders are ideal for first-time readers is the long gaps between consecutive POV chapters from the same character. For instance, in the All Leather Must Be Boiled reading order, there's a 49-chapter gap between Bran 2 and Bran 3. Similarly, Sansa, under her Elaine Stone alias, goes about 43 chapters between 2 of her 3 POV appearances. That's a long time to go without checking in on some of these characters, especially important ones like Bran and Sansa, who really serve as our only lens into the isolated regions of Beyond the Wall and the Eyrie within this story. When chapters are spaced that far apart, it can be easy for a reader to feel disoriented and go like, "Oh, Bran, haven't seen you in ages. What were you up to again?" Those long stretches make it hard for a reader to stay emotionally anchored to the story and make it very easy to forget key details about a character. All of these points lead me to the conclusion that reading A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons together isn't totally necessary. Sure, once you've read the story and already know what happens, yeah, it can be fun to go back on this through a reread, but on a first read, no one should feel obligated to go through the story this way. So up to this point, I've been pretty negative about my thoughts on these combined reading orders, so by now you're probably saying, alright Advocate, yes, I get it, you think these combined reading orders are dumb and are totally not a worthy substitute for reading both of these books separately. Can you get off my back now? Well, to that I say, comrade, I'm a crow, and your back is a comfortable landing spot for my kind talons. But also, despite my critiques, I do think there are certain quirks about the boiled leather reading order in particular that make for an interesting reread. Minor A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons spoilers ahead, but here are some of my highlights. Reading a Cersei chapter where she's convinced Tyrion is hiding behind the walls, only to flip over to the next page and read a Tyrion chapter where he just laughs to himself about how paranoid Cersei must be right now. Finding out in Feast that Davos is supposedly dead, only to see a few chapters later in Dance that he's very much alive and about to undertake one of the biggest, most pivotal missions ever in the North. Watching Jaime think about the late Jon Connington while confronting Red Ronette Connington, right after Tyrion's discovery that Jon Connington is still very much alive and secretly traveling as Griff. And biggest of all, Doran Martell unveiling his big fire and blood plot twist to Arianne Martell, and then flipping over to the next page to meet the catalyst of said fire and blood scheme, Quentyn Martell. Moments like these, although again not a substitute for reading these books separately, make this combined reading order a bit of fun and definitely worth checking out on a reread. But what say you? Have you read A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons in any of the reading orders we just mentioned? What were your thoughts on them? Comment below and let me know. Thank you so much for watching this video, guys. I truly do appreciate each and every one of you. I predominantly do book content on this channel, both inside and outside the A Song of Ice and Fire series, so if that interests you, definitely stick around for more video goodness. But until then, The Advocate, out.